I am here to discuss how environmental endocrine disrupting chemicals affect not only the developing brain of somebody who is exposed, but also the children and the grandchildren. We are interested in many of the functions that are controlled by the brain that involve endocrine hormones. So that includes reproduction, obesity, and how the brain functions, so neurobiological functions and neurons and synapses. In my lab, we study a group of chemicals that are called polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. These were chemicals that were used very heavily in the United States and around the world, but were banned in the late 1970s because they were found to have harmful effects in humans and in wildlife. So although they've been out of production for, 35 years now, they're still quite persistent in the environment because they just don't degrade easily. They were mainly used in factories, but they were also in capacitors and carbonless paper and many different kinds of industrial applications. They're these very sort of heavy, thick, greasy chemicals that help keep machinery lubricated. So they were fantastic in industry because they didn't break down, so you could use them for a very long period of time. But those very properties that made them really good in industry also made them very persistent in our environment. They're seen everywhere. They were originally found mostly in areas that had a lot of heavy industry, so that was many of the cities around the Great Lakes or the Steel Belt. But what happened was that they were not disposed of properly, or people didn't realize that there were toxic problems with these chemicals, and they leached into the environment. There were spills, they got into the water system, they got into the soil. We didn't know this at the time, but they also can get into the air. And so there are parts of the world that have never had any industry at all. But those parts of the world, you can detect the chemicals in the environment, and you can also detect them in the people and the wildlife that live in those areas because they've gotten everywhere and they just do not break down. The issue of the dose of exposure is a very tricky question because dose is relative, and exposure to one person may be different than the exposure of the same dose to another person because I may differ genetically from another person, so I may be more likely to have some sort of a hormone imbalance than another person, so I may be more sensitive to an endocrine disrupting chemical than that other person. But with that said, we also know that humans and animals have evolved with a very high sensitivity to natural hormones. So we know that in the body, and again I'll talk a little bit about development, where even a very, very small amount of hormone can actually have quite a potent effect on the developing brain or on the developing body and endocrine systems. So even low dose exposures can actually be quite problematic, and it just isn't as simple as if you have a high dose of something and it has a toxic effect, and then you start going lower and lower, eventually that toxic effect will go away. With endocrine disrupting chemicals, that has not proven to be the case, and we know that these low exposures are quite important.